Hi, folks. Welcome to another late night edition of Ecosystems and Communities and Ecosystem Notes. This is Ecosystems Part 2. There are some Google Forms available for you to answer while you're taking the notes. And what I recommend you do is check out the Google Form questions beforehand and use that as a guide for your note taking. Also, just a note, there are lots of vocab terms in these notes, okay? So just be aware of that. You might want to create like a list of vocab terms and write the definitions as you go through. We are covering sections 2.2 and 2.5 from the IB syllabus. Let's begin. We're going to be looking at the second law of thermodynamics, which is looking at the idea that energy is available to do work over time, but this ability to do work decreases over time. So the implications are that nothing is 100% efficient, and all reactions lose energy in the universe. And that systems spontaneously increase entropy, and we'll talk about entropy in just a second, and that heat flows from hot to cold. So, as energy is moving in the universe, it's going from um, uh, more organized, more high quality energy into less organized, less quality energy. And heat is dissipating, and that's why it's going from hot to cold. So, essentially, the universe is cooling down as energy is expanding into the universe. So this idea of entropy, and this is all review from section 1.3, entropy is the amount of disorder in a system, and the system we're talking about is the universe. So entropy is always increasing over time, and this continues to happen in the absence of additional energy put into that system. So the system at large is the universe, but the system we're talking about could be one of the biogeochemical cycles, or Earth, or a power plant. So in a power plant, all the energy will move towards heat in the absence of some new and additional form of energy, whether that additional form of energy is solar energy or chemical energy from fossil fuels. So without the increase of additional energy, it's just all moving towards heat. So an idea of entropy in terms of disorder is if you don't constantly tidy up, if you don't constantly put energy into tidying up your room, then over time it's going to get to a crazy level of disorder. Okay, so it's like an analogous way to think about it. So what happens as energy moves through the food chain? Well, because of entropy and the second law of thermodynamics, we know that energy is lost as heat in each transformation. Basically, every single time something is eating something and doing cellular respiration, heat is being released. The implications for that is that not a single transfer of energy from one trophic level to the next can be 100% efficient. Now, when we're measuring energy, there are two units of measurements that are commonly used. One is calories and the other one is joules. So let's talk about each of these. So 1 calorie, little c, is the amount of energy it takes to raise 1 gram of water 1 degree Celsius. 1 gram of water is equal to 1 milliliter of water. So that's like the equivalent of roughly 3 drops of water. Not a lot of water. When we're talking about calories in food, we're talking about big C. Okay? What big C is a kilocalorie. Okay? And so a kilocalorie is 100 calories. So another way to think about it is the amount of energy required to raise 1 kilogram of water 1 degree Celsius. Okay, so that kind of puts things into perspective. So when we're talking about the calories in food, we're really talking about kilocalories. Now, when we're talking about energy, oftentimes you'll see joules used. Okay, joules is it's another equivalent unit of measurement of energy. So 4.18 joules equals 1 little c calorie. Okay, So 4.18 joules equals 1 little c calorie. Okay, so those are some units of measurements to be aware of. When we're looking at energy moving through an ecosystem, we're basically talking about producers and consumers, okay? Producers do photosynthesis and create food, and this is high potential energy organic material. Then the consumer is going to eat that. Of that energy consumed, a big chunk of it is going to be just heat energy via cellular respiration, okay? A small chunk is not going to be absorbed at all and it's undigested and is passed through the digestive system and comes out as poop. Now, the middle portion is actually what's going to be used by the organism for growth and maintenance and repair, okay? So this orange is cellular respiration, and this is what's actually left over after cellular respiration for actual growth. So this is the piece that can be transferred to the next trophic level. This is already, the energy is being used, and because of the second law of thermodynamics, all that energy is going to be dissipated as heat. This is pooped out, so this is what's available to the next trophic level. So let's start at the very beginning, which is the sun. The sun is the ultimate source of energy for most ecosystems. The only, few examples of the sun not being the source of energy is in deep, deep hydrothermic vents, which is where those deep sea vents are the source of energy, and those do chemosynthesis rather than photosynthesis, the bacteria way down there. But the things that we're basically talking about in the biosphere that pertain to most of the biosphere are the producers that do photosynthesis. So the sun is the ultimate source of energy for our biosphere, okay? And the reaction for photosynthesis, as a reminder, is carbon dioxide plus water plus UV, the sun, yields glucose, more water, and oxygen, okay? In the spectrum of light, only the visible portion of light, of the visible portion of the electromagnetic spectrum, what is absorbed is blue violet light and red light from the plants. So those are the colors of lights that are absorbed in order to do photosynthesis. So what's reflected is green and yellow. And that is why leaves are greenish yellow. In the fall, when the leaves are not doing photosynthesis so readily, they start to die and become reddish, purplish, and bluish. But as they're doing photosynthesis, they are absorbing that blue, purple light and red light, and what they're reflecting is green and yellow. So whatever color shirt you're wearing right now, the color you see is the color not being absorbed, but rather the color reflected. If you have white, that means all the color is reflected, and if you have black, that means all the color is absorbed. Which is why on a hot day you want to wear a white shirt so all the colors can be reflected or all the light can be reflected. And on cold days it's good to wear a black shirt so all the light is being absorbed. So again, these chlorophyll B and chlorophyll A can absorb the blue and violet lights from the electromagnetic spectrum as well as the purple and orange light. Okay, so again, chlorophyll A is going to absorb red, and chlorophyll B is going to absorb orangish, okay, orangish red. So this is what is reflected. So here's the fate of all the solar radiation that comes to Earth, okay? This is a fairly important slide. So of all the energy released by the sun, only 1/1000th of that sun's total energy is actually even getting to the Earth's outer atmosphere. 30% of that is reflected back to space directly by our clouds, and 47% of that UV or solar energy coming to Earth is absorbed by our atmosphere. And we're going to talk a lot more about this in next semester when we talk about air resources. 23% runs our water cycle. This is basically all the evaporation that happens of water. So it's this UV energy is powering our water cycle. Less than 1% is driving our winds and oceans. So as molecules are being heated, they're spreading out, and as they're cooling down, they're condensing, and that spreading and condensing of molecules is wind. The spreading and condensing of molecules of water in the ocean is ocean currents. So, what is available to plants? Well, it's just this tiny fragment, the 0.02% captured by photosynthesis. It's just a small amount. And eventually, all of this UV radiation is going to go back to space radiated as heat because of entropy. This is very high quality energy, and heat is the lowest quality energy. So once all that energy gets used up, it gets kicked back out to space after all that cellular respiration is done as heat. So how does energy move through an ecosystem? Well, here are some vocab words. We have 3 different categories. We have producers, those that do photosynthesis and chemosynthesis. So we have plants and we have various types of bacteria. We have consumers, which includes heterotrophs, okay, those that eat other animals. And they can be herbivores or carnivores or omnivores. And they are decomposers. So these are mushrooms and our bacterial saprotrophs, which is a fun word to say. So let's start with the producers. The phototrophs, basically the producers, use solar radiation to produce sugar via photosynthesis. So this is our plants, algae, and bacteria. Okay, this is, again, they do the lion's share of sequestering carbon dioxide in order to make carbohydrate. A very small percentage use hydrogen sulfide from the deep hydrothermic vents to make sugar, and this is known as chemosynthesis. So there's bacteria way, 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 way deep down in the ocean floor doing this process. So it's a relatively small percentage of organisms on Earth doing this reaction compared to photosynthesis. Now, heterotrophs, these are consumers that break down stored sugars, and this is via aerobic respiration, okay, because they use oxygen. And this is our equation for cellular respiration. So they get the sugar from something they ate. So it could be a plant if you're a primary consumer, or an animal that ate a plant if you're a secondary or tertiary consumer. So they get that sugar, and they have some water that they're taking in, plus they're using oxygen, releasing a whole ton of carbon dioxide and a bunch of water and a ton of energy in the form of ATP. So again, our categories of consumers are primary consumers, also known as herbivores, which are getting this glucose directly from the plant. We have secondary consumers, which is a carnivore that is eating a primary consumer. A tertiary consumer, which is a top carnivore, which eats a secondary consumer or a primary consumer. And then other types of consumers are omnivores and detritivores. Omnivores are those that eat both plant and animals, and detritivores are like vultures and sharks that eat decomposing organisms. Very important for an ecosystem. Saprotrophs are a certain type of decomposer that feed off of dead organic matter in soil and release the nutrients. Examples of these are fungi and bacteria. So fungi are on land, and bacteria, for the most part, are in aquatic systems. So there's a couple of different ways to talk about who eats whom. So we have food chains, which are pretty simple, food webs, which are much more complex, and both of them are talking about trophic levels, which is energy flowing from one trophic level to another, or one eating level to another. So let's look at these, including the trophic levels. So a trophic level is going to show how energy is moving from one eating group to the next, okay? So we have our producers, our plants. Grasshoppers eat the plants, mouse eat the grasshopper, hawk eats the mouse, okay? We have our producers, our herbivores, our primary consumers, our uh, our other level of herbivores are mouse, or we can also, depending on the type of mouse, they can also be a omnivore. And then our top predator, okay? And in this case, it's a hawk. Now, one thing I want you guys to be aware of is the arrows, and I'll point that out in the next slide when we talk about food webs, which is much more complex. So it shows multiple ways that energy can move through an ecosystem, and it shows the various connections in an ecosystem rather than just one simple chain. Now, the more connections there are on an ecosystem, the more stable the ecosystem is. So let me explain this via an example. So there are two key things I want to point out. One, this is super important, is that whatever is being eaten, the arrow goes to the stomach of the thing that it's going to end up in. So let's look at this. So this raspberry is going to end up in the stomach of the squirrel. So the arrow is pointing to the squirrel. Think of it going to the squirrel's mouth and into its stomach. Okay? Pine cone is going to the squirrel's mouth and into the squirrel's stomach. The chipmunk is going to the fox's mouth and to the fox's stomach, hence the arrow is going to the fox. The mosquito, the evil mosquito, is going to, the arrows pointing to the mosquito because it's gonna suck the blood of the fox. It's gonna suck the blood of the deer, and basically of any mammal, and it is therefore the blood is going to the mosquito. However, the bird, thank you bird, eats the mosquito, so the mosquito is going to end up into the stomach of the bird. Okay. Now, that's one key element I want to point out because that's a common mistake people make is the direction of the arrows. And the direction of the arrows is quite important, right? Like if you draw it in the opposite direction, you're basically saying that this mouse ate the owl, which doesn't make sense. So that's one key element. The other one, the more arrows there are in an ecosystem, the more stable the ecosystem. And the reason for that is if something happened to an organism such as this rabbit, okay, this rabbit is food for the owl, and the rabbit eats the shrub over here. The rabbit is also food for this fox. So if something happened to the rabbit, well, the fox still has other things it could eat. The owl still has other things it could eat. The shrub would not get eaten, right? But maybe the squirrel would come in and do that job, or maybe not. But the entire ecosystem wouldn't go out of whack. Whereas if this was the entire ecosystem and something happened to the mouse, then all of a sudden the hawk would die as well. So the more connections there are, the more stable the ecosystem. You want a ton of arrows in a stable ecosystem. Now, as energy moves through an ecosystem, most of that energy is lost via cellular respiration, okay? So organisms are not 100% efficient. In fact, they're only roughly 10% efficient. Only 10% of the energy makes it from one trophic level to the next. 90% of it is lost via cellular respiration and fecal matter loss, okay? So this is known as the 10% rule. Only 10% of the energy from one trophic level is going to the next trophic level. So most of this energy is lost as heat in each transformation. Sometimes it's lost as light, and that is how bioluminescent organisms have light. Instead of that energy being lost as heat from cellular respiration, it's being lost as light. And sometimes that energy is being dissipated rather than heat from cellular respiration. It's dissipated via electricity from cellular respiration. And this is how electric eels get their electricity. That's kind of fun, huh? Because energy is only being transferred at a rate of about 10% from one trophic level to the next, we only get about 3 to 4 levels in a food chain. And there's fewer and fewer organisms as you go up the food chain. So that is one huge reason why food chains are pyramid shape. Okay, so let's look at an example. So here's a Arctic boreal ecosystem, like high Arctic Circle ecosystem, food web example. Notice how it is not as stable as the forest ecosystem we looked at, okay? So the rabbits are eating all this plant life, same with the caribou, same with the hedgehog, okay? The wolves are eating all these primary consumers. And the people are also eating these primary consumers. So really, there's only like 2 top predators because this ecosystem just can't support more than that. Let's look at that in different ways. So the ways we can look at ecosystems are 3 key ways. One is the pyramid of numbers, which shows the number of individuals at each trophic level. And this does not necessarily mean that it's always a pyramid shape. And here's an example. If you are looking at a grassland in the summer, well, the pyramid of numbers is looking at the number of individual organisms in a certain size. So for example, in 1 square kilometer, okay? So this is the number of literal grass blades in that square kilometer, which is going to be a bunch, right? In that, if you were to compare a forest in the summer, well, in 1 square kilometer, you might get like 10 trees, okay? So the numbers are going to be substantially less compared to a grassland. Now, the primary consumers in a grassland are going to be like your bunnies and your hedgehogs and things like that. And so the numbers are going to be significantly less than the number of grass blades. Over here, your primary consumers might be like various types of birds, squirrels, the things that we saw in that forest ecosystem with a ton of arrows, okay? And there's going to be a lot more of individuals of those compared to the number of trees, for example. Our secondary consumers will be less than our primary consumers, and from this point, it will start to resemble a pyramid shape, okay? Again, our secondary consumers are less than our primary, but not by a ton. And then our tertiary consumers, our top predators, are always going to be significantly less because they're an area just can't support that many of them. So if you see a wonky looking pyramid, it's probably a pyramid of numbers. It could be a pyramid of biomass, but it might be a pyramid of numbers. It is definitely not an energy pyramid. So pyramid of numbers, again, looking at the grasslands versus the primary consumers versus the top predator, okay? So again, we have like 10,000 grasses, 10 field mice, and 1 hawk. Pyramid of biomass is looking at the amount of organic material in mass, okay? And again, you can also have a atypical pyramid shape. And consumers may eat the most of the producers as they're being made. So for example, in the ocean, you have a ton of producers, right? But the biomass available at any extra biomass available at any given time is not that much because what we're really looking at is algae, okay? Because the consumers are eating it, the primary consumers are eating it at such a rapid rate that there's only very little available that's not already been eaten. But from that point, it kind of maintains its pyramid shape. Whereas in an abandoned field, right, there's just a ton of grass over there, so it's the biomass of grass is going to be greater and maintain more of a pyramid shape. So here's an example of a pyramid of biomass. So we're weighing the total amount of grass, okay? So this is the amount of grams per meter square. So this is looking at 10,000 grams of grass in 1 square meter. That's quite a bit. And if you're looking at primary consumers, just the grasshoppers, that's 1,000 grasshoppers in that square meter. You might find 1 toad, maybe, or 2 toads, and that would be about 100 grams, and then probably 1 snake, which is going to be 10 grams per meter square, okay? So it maintains a pyramid shape, but if this was an aquatic system, then the amount of grass that's not already been eaten by like the whales would be significantly less. Let me see if I have a picture of this for you. Oh, I don't. That's a bummer. Okay. So imagine this is algae and this is whale. Well, the biomass of whale is going to be way more than the biomass of algae not already being eaten. So the one that really is going to give us the clearest picture is going to be the pyramid of energy. And this always has a pyramid shape. So the reason for this pyramid shape is because of the second law of thermodynamics and the idea of entropy. So energy is always lost as you go up, and this shape is due to the 10% rule. So more energy is maintained if there are fewer levels. And hence, it begs the question, why should we eat lower off the food chain? Think about that for a moment. Pause the video and think about that. Write your answer down, and we're going to address it in the slides to come. Okay, so pyramid of energy for a river ecosystem. So this is gross primary productivity, which is also known as photosynthesis, okay? This image is crazy important. Now, net primary productivity is what's left over after respiration. So this is all the photosynthesis. Gross primary productivity is before, so all the photosynthesis done by the producers. Then there's respiration, and what's left over is the available amount for the next trophic level. So this is what is able to be passed on to this next trophic level. Now, of this next trophic level, a big chunk of it is used up in respiration. And so now this is what's available for the following trophic level, okay? So let me explain that again. This big chunk that you see down here, this big rectangle that is going to show all of photosynthesis. Then you subtract whatever amount of energy is used, and in this case it's kilocalories per meter square per year, is used for respiration, and what's left over is net primary productivity. This is what's available for plant growth. Now, just because that plant grew doesn't mean all and every single bit of it is going to be eaten up, right? Also, of the plant that does get eaten up by the next trophic level, the primary consumers, and in this case, this is a caddisfly larva, and we're going to get an opportunity to play with these guys next semester, okay? So of all the aquatic plant life that the caddisfly larva eats, it's going to poop out a bunch of it, right? It's not going to absorb a bunch of it to begin with. And it's going to exhale out a bunch of it via oxygen, carbon dioxide. It's going to do cellular respiration, and that's going to get rid of a whole bunch of the energy that's used, and that cellular respiration is keeping the caddisfly alive. So whatever is not pooped out, not used for cellular respiration, is available for its growth, okay? So think of cellular respiration as maintenance, and then whatever's left over after cellular respiration, aka maintenance, and poop is what's available for growth. So this growth amount is what's available for the next trophic level. However, not every bit of it is going to be able to be eaten. And of what is eaten, a big chunk of it is going to get pooped out. Whatever's not pooped out, there's a substantial portion for the secondary consumers, and in this case, this is the bluegill fish, is going to be used for maintenance via cellular respiration. So whatever is not pooped out and whatever is not used for cellular respiration is available for growth, okay? So of that bit that's available for growth, that is what's available for the tertiary consumer, the largemouth bass. So again, whatever's not pooped out by the largemouth bass and whatever's not used up for maintenance, aka cellular respiration, whatever's left over is available for growth of the largemouth bass. So this shows you that the base of the pyramid, there's got to be a lot of those guys, because caddisfly larva isn't going to eat one plant, it has to eat a ton in order to get its calories. The secondary consumer, in this case the bluegill fish, isn't going to eat one caddisfly larva, it's going to eat a ton in order to get its the energy it needs to survive. And the tertiary consumers is not going to eat just one bluegill fish, it has to eat a bunch of them, right? So as you go up the food chain, there has to be fewer and fewer and fewer of those organisms because each one has to eat a bunch of the trophic level below it. We're going to come back to this idea quite a bit because this is such a big idea. So again, looking back at this diagram, okay, so the producers do photosynthesis. Whatever's not used for cellular respiration is used for growth. Okay, so again, gross is photosynthesis, net is photosynthesis minus respiration. Oops. And whatever is available is of that net is available for the next trophic level. So the deer eats the grass that has grown, that net. Of that net that the producer or the primary consumer has eaten of the producer, a big chunk of it is going to get pooped out. Okay, it's not absorbed or anything, it's just pooped out. A big chunk of it is going to be used for cellular respiration. So we have food in minus poop minus cellular respiration. Whatever is left over is now net secondary productivity, and that's this pink line. And this is what's used for growth for the next trophic level to eat. So this is kind of looking at the system at large. So we have light energy comes in, producers make a ton of food, okay? Then that producer gets eaten by primary consumers. Primary consumers get eaten by secondary consumers and tertiary consumers. All of those are being decomposed by detritus, okay, detritus feeders, and decomposers and bacteria. And that goes back into the ecosystem to help put nutrients back into the soil, which can continue this cycle, okay? That's what's going on with the matter, okay? So the matter is being recycled. Remember, Earth is a closed system for matter. So the blue is the matter. It is a closed system for matter. The red is energy. So as it's going through each trophic level, a big chunk of that energy, okay, so this is all the light energy that's not being used at all. Each bit of this arrow is showing you what is going to go back out from Earth, back out to space in the form of heat energy from cellular respiration. So when photosynthesis occurs, cellular respiration is also occurring from the plants to keep themselves alive. That's going to release a whole ton of energy that's going to go back out to space. Producer or primary consumers are going to eat this food, poop a bunch of it out, which is going to go to the detritus feeders, which is going to, that plus the bacteria and fungi are going to put the nutrients back into the soil. But the energy, as it does cellular respiration, 90% of that is going to go as heat out to space. The secondary consumers, again, same deal. It's going to poop out a bunch of stuff. Detritus feeders and bacteria and fungi are going to deal with the matter and put that matter back into the biosphere. But as it does cellular respiration, this secondary consumers and third order consumers, tertiary consumers are going to do cellular respiration. All that energy is going to go back out into space. Okay, so this is looking at the big picture. Red is energy, blue is matter. So why should we eat lower off in the food chain? Well, we are technically omnivores. However, we eat much more meat than what our bodies and the ecosystem can probably sustain. Let's think back to the origin of our species. We, Homo sapiens sapien, have been hunter-gatherers for probably about 90-ish thousand years. The agricultural revolution happened about 10,000 years ago. Okay, so a big chunk of that time, we only got to eat meat roughly once a month. The other 29 to 30 days of the month, we were looking for berries, we were looking for tubers, which is like roots, and getting a lot of carbohydrates and starch and sugars and stuff from fruit and vegetables, whatever we can find. When the agricultural revolution happened, we started introducing way more meat into our diet. And now that we have factory farming, we have done this crazy thing. We have turned our farms into protein factories in reverse. So this is looking at the conversion ratio. Basically, how much primary producers does it take in order to raise cows, pigs, turkeys, this is eggs, it's hard to see over here, and chickens, okay? So we are to raise beef, we need 16 pounds of grain in order to make 1 pound of beef. So it puts our trophic pyramid, we require a ginormous base in order to make a primary consumer that we're going to eat. Okay. Pigs are less so, but still substantial. So for every pound of pork we get, we use 6 pounds of grain in order to raise the pork. So you can almost imagine turning this graph sideways to show you what the size of the producer level should be. Okay, and then the consumer level, if this is 16, this would just be 1 for the primary consumer, and we would have to be a tiny little sliver of that 1. However, we are not tiny slivers. We are 7 almost 2 billion people. So that just shows you how much primary producers we are going to need for every pound of beef, since in order to meet our beef demands, we have millions and millions of cows, which means that we need trillions of tons of grain in order to support the cow, in order to eat that cow. Okay. So looking at this diagram, if you're going to eat meat, it makes the most sense to eat eggs and chicken, because that requires the least amount of grain, and therefore is the most efficient way to eat meat. Okay. We're going to stop here and talk about this idea much more down the road. Good night.